They say that when you stare into the abyss stares back. But what happens when the abyss wears a leather beak and calls itself a healer? What happens when the very person sworn to fight death becomes its most loyal servant? In the winter of 1665, the Great Plague of London was consuming the city like a ravenous beast. Bodies piled in the streets, entire families vanished overnight, and the living envied the dead. Among the chaos walked figures that looked more like demons than men, the plague doctors. With their black robes and grotesque, bird-like masks, they were humanity's last hope against the invisible enemy. But this isn't a story about heroism. This isn't a tale of medical triumph. This is the story of Dr. Malpheus Blackwood, a man who began as London's most dedicated plague physician, and ended as something far more terrifying than the disease he fought. A man who didn't just treat the plague, he became it. And if the accounts are true, he might still be out there. Dr. Malpheus Blackwood was not born evil. In fact, he was quite the opposite. Born in 1628 to a family of modest means in Canterbury, Malpheus showed an early fascination with the human body that bordered on obsession. While other children played with wooden toys, young Malpheus dissected dead birds he found in the garden, carefully documenting their anatomy in a leather journal that would later become infamous. By the age of 21, he had completed his medical training at Cambridge, specializing in what was then called pestilential medicine, the study of plague and other epidemic diseases. His professors noted his exceptional dedication, though some whispered about his unusual methods and the strange gleam in his eyes when discussing death and disease. When the Great Plague struck London in 1665, Malpheus was among the first to volunteer. While other physicians fled the city, he walked straight into the heart of darkness. Armed with his leather beak mask filled with aromatic herbs and an unshakable belief that he could conquer death itself. The plague doctor's costume was terrifying. By design, the long black robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the leather gloves, and most memorably, the beak-shaped mask that made its wearer look like a giant raven. The beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, and dried flowers, believed to purify the poisonous air that carried the disease. But for Malpheus, the mask became something more. It became his identity. His shield against the horror he witnessed daily. In the first months of the outbreak, Malpheus worked tirelessly. He treated hundreds of patients, from wealthy merchants to street beggars, showing no discrimination in his care. His methods were unconventional but effective. He achieved a survival rate of nearly 30%, remarkable for the time when most plague victims died within days. But something began to change in the doctor during the winter of 1665. Colleagues noticed that he rarely removed his mask, even when not treating patients. He began to walk differently, with a peculiar jerky gait that reminded witnesses of a bird's movements. His voice became hollow and distant, muffled by the leather beak that seemed to have fused with his face. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came in February of 1660. A fellow physician, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, visited Malpheus in his clinic and made a disturbing discovery. The usually meticulous doctor had stopped keeping proper records of his patients. Instead, his desk was covered with bizarre drawings, anatomical sketches that showed human bodies in impossible configurations, organs arranged in patterns that defied medical knowledge, and most disturbing of all, detailed illustrations of what appeared to be plague victims transforming into bird-like creatures. When Hartwell confronted Malpheus about the drawings, the masked doctor simply tilted his head at an unnatural angle and replied, "They show me what they're becoming. The disease isn't killing them, it's changing them into something beautiful." The transformation accelerated rapidly after that encounter. Patients began reporting that Dr. Blackwood's treatments had become increasingly bizarre. Instead of traditional remedies, he would make small incisions in specific patterns across their bodies, claiming he was opening channels for the humors to flow properly. He would whisper to his patients in a language no one recognized, and his touch had become unnaturally cold, even through his leather gloves. But the most disturbing change was in his appetite. The doctor, who had once been known for his hearty meals, began refusing all food except for scraps of raw meat, which he would consume by somehow maneuvering them through his beak mask. Witnesses described the sound of tearing and wet gulping that emerged from behind the leather barrier by March of 1666. The patients Malpheus had treated in recent months began exhibiting symptoms that no physician had ever documented. They developed a rasping cough that sounded remarkably like bird calls. Their fingers began to elongate and curve, resembling talons. Most horrifying of all, they began to crave raw flesh with an intensity that drove them to attack their own family members. The authorities were initially skeptical of these reports, dismissing them as plague-induced hysteria. But the evidence became impossible to ignore when 17 of Malpheus's recent patients were found in an abandoned church, having apparently turned on each other in a cannibalistic frenzy. The scene was described by the investigating magistrate as a charnel house of human remains arranged in a pattern that hurt the eyes to look upon. A warrant was issued for Dr. Blackwood's arrest, but when the constables arrived at his clinic, they found something that defied explanation. The building appeared to have been abandoned for months, covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings. The examination tables were stained with what appeared to be blood, but chemical analysis revealed it to be a substance that didn't match any known bodily fluid. In the center of the main treatment room, they found Malpheus's journal, left open to a page that would haunt investigators for years to come. Written in his increasingly erratic handwriting, the final entry read, "The plague was never the disease. The plague was the cure. We were meant to change, meant to evolve beyond the constraints of human flesh. I have seen what lies beyond the veil of death, and it is beautiful. The transformation is complete. I am no longer bound by the limitations of mortality. I am the bridge between life and death, between human and divine. The others will follow. The flock will grow." But the most chilling discovery came in the basement of the clinic. The constables found a series of stone chambers that hadn't appeared on any building plans, carved with symbols that predated Christian Britain by millennia. The walls were covered in what appeared to be anatomical drawings, but ones that showed impossible hybrid creatures, part human, part bird, part something else entirely. In the center of the largest chamber stood an altar made of human bones, arranged in a pattern that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. On the altar lay a collection of plague doctor masks, each one slightly different from the last, as if they had been crafted to accommodate faces that were no longer entirely human. The investigation was quietly closed, and all evidence was sealed by order of the Crown. The official report stated that Dr. Malpheus Blackwood had died of the plague. But privately, investigators knew better. He hadn't died, he had transformed into something else entirely. The sightings began almost immediately. Throughout the remaining months of the Great Plague, witnesses reported encounters with a figure in a plague doctor's costume, but one that moved within human grace and spoke in a voice like rustling feathers. This entity would appear at the bedsides of the dying, not to heal them, but to whisper something in their ears that would cause them to smile with an expression of terrible understanding. Those who survived these encounters invariably developed the same symptoms as Malpheus's final patients: the elongated fingers, the craving for raw flesh, the ability to make sounds that were more bird than human. They would disappear within days, leaving behind only strange arrangements of bones and feathers that formed patterns too complex for the human mind to fully comprehend. As the plague finally began to subside in 1666, so too did the sightings of the transformed Dr. Badair. The story didn't end there. Throughout the following centuries, during major plague outbreaks across Europe, witnesses would report encounters with a figure matching Malpheus's description, always during the darkest hours of the epidemic, always appearing to those who were closest to death. During the cholera pandemic of 1832, a dying woman in Paris claimed that a bird-masked figure had visited her hospital room and offered her a choice: die as a human, or live as something greater. She chose the latter, and her body was found the next morning arranged in a pattern of bones and flesh that formed symbols predating written language. In 1894, during the bubonic plague outbreak in Hong Kong, British colonial officials reported several incidents involving a plague doctor who appeared to be treating patients with methods that defied medical understanding. Witnesses described seeing him remove his mask to reveal not a human face, but a skull covered in black feathers, with eyes that glowed like burning coals. The most documented encounter occurred during the 1918 influenza pandemic. A military hospital in France reported visits from a plague doctor who claimed to be researching new treatments for the disease. Nurses noted that his presence seemed to calm dying patients, but those who survived his treatments invariably developed bizarre symptoms, an aversion to cooked food, an ability to mimic any sound they heard, and most disturbing of all, a compulsion to arrange objects in specific patterns that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Marcel Dubois, the hospital's chief physician, attempted to confront the mysterious figure, and later wrote in his private journal, "I followed him into the morgue and witnessed something that has destroyed my faith in the natural order. He was not treating the dead, he was communing with them. The corpses were responding to his presence, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak, and the sounds that emerged, they were not human. They were beautiful and terrible, like the song of angels who had seen too much of hell." The encounter ended when the plague doctor turned to face Dr. Dubois, and the physician saw what lay beneath the mask, not a face, but a void filled with swirling patterns of light and shadow that seemed to extend infinitely inward. Dubois spent the rest of his life in a private asylum, drawing the same symbols over and over again until his fingers bled. Modern investigators have attempted to trace the pattern of sightings, looking for connections that might explain the mystery of Dr. Malpheus Blackwood. What they've found is disturbing. The appearances correlate not just with plague outbreaks, but with specific astronomical events, particularly the conjunction of certain planets that ancient texts associate with transformation and rebirth. More troubling still, analysis of the symbols found at various encounter sites reveals a progression. As if each appearance represents a stage in some vast, incomprehensible plan, the patterns become more complex over time, incorporating elements from quantum physics and advanced mathematics that shouldn't have been known to observers from previous centuries. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were scattered reports of a figure in a plague doctor costume appearing in hospitals around the world. Security cameras captured blurred images of someone moving through corridors with inhuman speed, always just out of focus, always managing to avoid clear identification. A nurse in northern Italy reported an encounter that mirrors historical accounts. With chilling accuracy, she claimed that during the night shift, she encountered a tall figure in a plague doctor's costume standing beside a dying patient's bed. When she approached, the figure turned to face her, and she saw that the leather mask had somehow merged with the wearer's face, creating a seamless hybrid of human and bird features. The entity spoke to her in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The cycle continues. The transformation spreads. What began in London centuries ago will reach its culmination soon. The boundary between life and death grows thin, and soon there will be no boundary at all. When the nurse looked back at the patient, she found that the elderly man who had been dying of COVID-19 was now sitting up in bed, his eyes reflecting light like a bird's. He smiled at her with teeth that had become sharp and pointed, and whispered, "Thank you for understanding. The change is beautiful." Both the patient and the plague doctor figure vanished before security arrived, leaving behind only a pattern of feathers and bone fragments arranged in a symbol that defied geometric logic. The nurse was found the next morning, catatonic, her fingers bent into impossible angles that resembled talons. Recent investigations have uncovered evidence that suggests Dr. Malpheus Blackwood's transformation may have been part of something much older and more terrifying than a simple case of plague-induced madness. Archaeological excavations beneath London have revealed a network of chambers that match the descriptions found in his clinic. But carbon dating suggests they were carved thousands of years before his birth. The symbols found in these chambers appear in various forms throughout human history, in ancient Egyptian tombs, In Celtic stone circles, in the margins of medieval manuscripts describing plague outbreaks, they seem to represent some form of knowledge or power that transcends human understanding, something that uses disease and death as tools for transformation. Perhaps most disturbing of all, analysis of historical records suggests that figures, similar to the transformed Dr. Blackwood, have appeared throughout history, always during times of great plague and suffering. They are mentioned in fragmentary accounts from the Black Death of the 14th century, in reports from the Justinian plague of the 6th century, and in even older texts that describe similar entities during the plague of Athens in 430 BCE. The pattern that emerges suggests that these appearances are not random, but part of a vast cycle that spans millennia. Each outbreak serves as a step in some incomprehensible plan, each transformation bringing humanity closer to a fate that defies imagination. So what became of Dr. Malpheus Blackwood? The truth is, he may never have left us at all. If the accounts are accurate, he didn't die during the Great Plague of London. He evolved beyond death itself, becoming something that exists in the spaces between life and mortality. Every time humanity faces a great plague, every time death stalks the streets and hope seems lost, witnesses report encounters with a figure in a plague doctor's mask, always helping, always healing, always transforming those he touches into something that is no longer quite human. The most terrifying possibility is that his work isn't finished. The patterns found at encounter sites suggest a progression, a plan that spans centuries and involves the gradual transformation of humanity itself. Each plague outbreak serves as another step in this incomprehensible design. Each transformed victim becomes another piece in a puzzle too vast for human minds to grasp. As our world faces new pandemics and unknown diseases, as the boundaries between life and death become increasingly blurred by advancing medical technology, one has to wonder, are we approaching the culmination of Dr. Blackwood's centuries-long plan? Are we witnessing the final stages of humanity's transformation into something beyond recognition? The next time you see a figure in a plague doctor's mask, the next time you hear the sound of leather creaking and feathers rustling in an empty hospital corridor, remember the story of Malpheus Blackwood. Remember that some healers cure the disease by becoming it, and some doctors save their patients by damning them to something far worse than death. Because, in the end, the most terrifying monsters are those who genuinely believe they're helping us, and somewhere out there, in the spaces between heartbeats and the silence between screams, Dr. Malpheus Blackwood continues his work, one transformation at a time. The plague doctor who became the disease is still practicing medicine. The question is, are you ready to be his next patient? Sweet dreams.